Good evening, audience, and we welcome you to another episode of our podcast, which is, of course, Polaris for Dissidents. And tonight we are joined by Alexander Wolfheze and Hans Vogel, of course, who wrote the article that we will be treating tonight, and Charles Daly from Texas, and myself, of course, from the Netherlands, Sietse Bosman. Um, Hans wrote a very interesting article about war, and especially the war in Middle East and the war in, of course, Ukraine and Russia, and the fact that there are two conventions, actually, the Hague Conventions. I forgot the years, but there were two, and there were all kinds of agreements signed in these conventions pertaining to how to conduct war civilly, basically. It prohibited, for instance, the use of poisonous weapons, and it also stated that was one I thought was very interesting. It forbade the sneaky or not outright killing of enemies or attacking, so it had to be in the open, basically. Um, but anyway, these conventions were drafted and signed by a whole lot of countries to minimize basically civilian casualties. And Hans's article argues, rightfully so, I believe, that increasingly we see that the death toll among civilians is rising again, and that even in the absence of the state of total war, by that we mean the total mobilization of a country for the war effort, and thereby making all civilians military targets because they produce military assets. We are not in a condition of total war, and yet we see the deliberate destruction of civilian targets. Gaza is, of course, the biggest example of that. It is completely flattened and destroyed. And well, Hans makes the case for this in his article. So I was wondering which one of you, Alexander or Charles, would like to give his opening comments on this.
I,
Alexander?
I can make a few
Oh,
remarks.
yes, Charles, go ahead.
Well, just reading through these articles, it just seems very naive to me. The people who composed these, did they actually trust that everyone would live up to their agreements? I don't know a lot about the conditions under which these were written down and agreed to. Let me just give a couple of examples here. So, Article 23, like you said, to employ poison or poisoned arms. Well, of course, that was broken immediately in World War One by the Germans and using gas. That's poison. So that was what 14 or 7 to 14 years later, depending on which version of the International Peace Conference we're talking about, 1899 or 1907. Point four under Article 23. Let's see. To kill or wound an enemy, it's prohibited to kill or wound an enemy who, having laid down arms or having no longer means of defense, has surrendered at discretion. Well, I mean, the Russians at the end of World War II raped and beat who knows how many Germans, uh, assumedly that they had agreed to this agreement decades earlier. The idea of declaring that no quarter will be given is prohibited. So you can't even declare it. I mean, it just seems kind of fanciful to me. And besides, I mean, throughout history, whether it's the West or East or anywhere else in the world, people are regularly, the civilians are enslaved, beaten, raped, etc. So where did this come from, this sort of idealistic thinking, that this would actually be followed by anyone?
Hans, do you want to reply to
Yeah,
that?
yeah, that's a good question. And I think I tried to make this clear in the article, but that after the 30 Years' War that ended ended in the peace treaty of Westphalia in 1648. It had an enormous death toll among the civilian population of Germany, especially. Between 4 and 8 million people in Germany, civilians, were just randomly killed, just for the good of things, for the heck of it. And pillage and raping was on the order of the day. And afterward, other wars like the War of the Spanish Succession at the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, the 7 Years' War, the wars of the 19th century, until the the Franco-Prussian War. Civilian populations were left largely untouched. It was all these battles in those wars were fought on a battlefield by well-ordered troops, well-organized armies, extremely disciplined troops. It took about 4 or 5 years for infantrymen to be trained to operate correctly on a battlefield, and they had to stand still when bombarded by enemy artillery, hold their ground, and so it was a full-blown profession, soldier. And all those wars in Europe between 1648 and the First World War in Europe were largely fought by armies on battlefields without affecting the civilian population. So I think that the desire of the Emperor Nicholas II of Russia in convening the Hague Peace Conference and getting all these dozens of representatives from 28 independent countries. There weren't any more, I think. Perhaps 1 or 2 independent princes in Africa, but they didn't have the wherewithal to be a modern modern state. So all states that carried the name sort of with dignity, almost 30 states in the world, there weren't any more, went to these peace conferences in The Hague, and they signed 2 conventions. And they were convinced, I think, most of them, that they would adhere to it. And indeed, in the First World War, the Germans began to use in what is now Belgium, against the English mustard gas, I think. But it was very briefly and very incidental, not on a massive sort of organized, persistent scale. But I think it was an answer to the. No, it wasn't. But it was no. I think it was in answer to the British propaganda against Germans killing babies in Louvain in Belgium, which they didn't, because there was a whole propaganda
But Hans,
campaign.
this is sort of making my point. You can always rationalize some deviation from the rules that you agreed to earlier on any point. That's the whole point.
Yeah, of course. Yes,
like you
that's
write
it.
all this stuff down, everybody said, "Oh yeah, we want to help humanity. We don't want to hurt these people who are innocent." But as soon as somebody does something a little bit outside of the bounds that you don't like, then you feel like you can bend the rules too. That's the way it always happens.
I agree, but I want to go a little further, because there's this myth about German troops in the Second World War being outrageously cruel to the Russian population, the SS, etc., etc. Few people know that in the German ranks, more than 12,000 soldiers were executed because they were not behaving according to the rules not to touch civilian populations. Because if a unit operates in enemy territory and the soldiers go about raping and stealing and killing and pillaging as much as they desire, it erodes the enemy, the discipline of the unit. So it's bad for a unit when the soldiers go on their own and rape and pillage. So it's
well, the example I gave from World War
II.
The example I had given from World War II briefly was the Russians persecuting the Germans at the end of World War II.
But that's an example that I think is also, but it has a different context and a different background. I think that's why. But we can get into that later. So, because that's sort of that has to do with the general attitude after the Second World War there was there such a campaign of retribution and hatred after a war in Europe as after the Second World War. Yes, maybe it was worse even than the First World War. But the fact that you take enemy officers and politicians and put them on trial was never seen before. That's outrageous. That's crazy. It was never done in Europe because all these people that worked with Napoleon and fought with Napoleon, they were seamlessly introduced, sort of inserted into the administrations and the armies of the countries after the fall of Napoleon. There was no problem. If you had been with Napoleon, there was no problem when Napoleon was gone to be hired again by your country. No problem. And that's
Well,
unique
yeah,
what
I'd
happened
like
in the
to
Second World
comment
War.
on that a little bit because I think that to a large degree there was a very much the component of honor in combat in Europe, because of course combat originated, or let's say the idea with honorable combat was something that was associated with knights and a certain aristocratic idea that even though war is probably necessary sometimes, it at least should be conducted with honor. And so you understood that your enemy was no less honorable than you were. He fought for his motivations, and you fought for your own motivations, and therefore there was no enmity after the battle was concluded. One party won and the other lost, and let's get on with things. And as you said, after the First World War and the Second World War, there was a deliberate attempt to actually try and exterminate the enemy. Now that, of course, is not unique in history. I mean, we know from the Greek stories and that entire cities were destroyed and women and children murdered and enslaved. So that's not something necessarily new. But at least we had a very long period in Europe where war was conducted by professional armies. They were all hired soldiers, and they fought for some sort of honor. And even though that might seem a little bit ambiguous, a paid soldier fighting for honor, but at least the profession of soldier was regarded as a noble and honorable profession, and that changed after the First World War. And I do think it is very ironic that in the Second World War, we actually saw with the so-called bad guys, the Germans, who really tried to adhere to this sort of code of honor of war. We have seen this many times. Hitler actually prohibited the use of poison gas. He did not want to bomb civilian targets. He let the English escape. He could have destroyed the French. He could have destroyed the French. No, it was the English. I'm sorry. He could have destroyed.
Dunkirk, yes.
He could have destroyed the English at Dunkirk, but he let them leave back to England, out of because he regarded them as a brother people. He did not want to fight the English. And so that to me is very ironic that we have this situation. So Alexander, would you like to comment now on the article by Hans?
Yes, thank you, Sietse, and thanks, Hans, for the very useful introduction, because I do believe that his article is very timely in the sense that it discusses a problem that is very acute, the problem of civilians being targeted instead of military being targeted by deliberately as a matter of policy. And I think here a point of discussion that can be elucidated is the point of the international legal order, the framework within which war takes place. So we have the famous German legal scholar, international law scholar as well, Carl Schmitt, and he said that up till his time, that is till just the Second World War, there existed such a thing called, with a beautiful Latin legal phrase, the Ius Publicum Europae. So that is the European public law, international law in a certain sense. And he also referred to this as the nomos of the world, so the law of the world. Now, this is a case of a particular law that has been created within a certain civilizational circle, namely the Western Christian world, being applied to the whole world, being applied worldwide because Europe at a certain point ruled almost the entire world. And that law was implemented by force by the European powers throughout the world. So the nomos of the world, he called it. Of course, the origins of it lie in European tradition. And in European tradition, the law applied to equals. And equals in the European tradition only applies to a very small group in the highest regions. That means the monarchs, the kings. Only they were equal partners, and they were like members of a club who agreed on certain behavioral rules between each other. Now, later, of course, as the countries became democratized, as they became nations, this law that was agreed upon between the rulers was extended to the republics and to the governments of these republics in Europe as well. So the French Republic was accepted also as a bearer of sovereignty. Of course, Carl Schmitt points out that the one exception to the rule that existed up till, let's say, 1945, the end of the Second World War, was the United States. The United States was a law unto itself and did not abide by the European perspective. It was not a member of the club. Now, this has, of course, two sides. That is not just the chauvinist and the traditionalist speaking in Carl Schmitt, but also the reality being addressed of how America came to be, what was its vision, and what was its origin. And he stated that by its very nature, the United States, the country that became the superpower, the sole superpower in the world in 1991, by its very nature, it was incapable and unwilling to abide by the European rules. And I think that he was proven right in the sense that in 1945, the opponents of the victors of the Second World War, so the winners, they were both outside of this European framework, this framework of the Jus Europeum, Publicum Europeum. So this law was not upheld by either United States or the other great winner, which was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had, for example, not agreed to any of the Geneva rules and had put itself outside of legal bounds by the terror reign that it had inflicted upon its own people in the aftermath of the Second World War and the Revolution. So both winners, great winners of the Second World War in Europe, were unwilling and unbound by this law. So the losers were put on trial, literally. Something, as Hans put out correctly, was never done before. So even Napoleon, he was just exiled, but nobody would dare to put him on trial because he was an equal among others. Now, of course, this his small history lesson also, it reflects the reality of geopolitics. The real geopolitical power shifted away from Europe and resided first in a duopoly, so Soviet Union versus the United States, and then in a monopoly in the United States alone. And I think this is the situation we find ourselves in right now. There is no European law applicable anymore to the international system. Whatever is left of it is incorporated, I would say, for propaganda purposes. So what we have left in the United Nations Charter is merely sick leave, and it functions as such. And that this would happen was also predicted quite accurately at the beginning of the 20th century. So at the same time that the final institutions were put in place that would make the norms of the world come true for everybody. So that is exactly what Hans referred to, the Hague Conventions. In that time, already people understood that something was about to break. So I like to quote in this respect a famous Dutchman, is a politician and an anarchist, but also a thinker, Dominee Nieuwenhuis. When the last institution was concluded in 1913, 1 year before the First World War, namely the Peace Palace that was supposed to protect the peace in the world forever afterwards, amen. He said publicly, so the Peace Palace has been inaugurated, let the Great War begin. And as clockwork, a few months later, the Great War started. This, of course, is given by the geopolitical climate at that time. The decline of Europe, already visible with the rise of Japan and with the rise of the United States in that time, was already clearly going down. It was not anymore the sole reference frame. And I think we are finding ourselves now, at this moment, back in the situation that the Jus Publicum Europaeum, the nomos of the world, has been completely eradicated, even from memory, even from institutions. So what we are left with now is the situation that existed before this Jus Publicum Europaeum existed. And this is, of course, the law of the jungle. When, as Charles pointed out correctly, uh, people refer back to the origins. It is an all against all and no holds barred. And this phrase comes to mind. So the European rulers that before had this common set of rules, they refer to the parts outside of Europe that were not in these laws as partibus infidelium. So the parts where the believers reside, and there no rules applied. There everything was free, and their horrible misdeeds that were unthinkable within European legal framework be freely committed. And I think that we are now finding ourselves back in that situation. The United Nations is bankrupt, as everybody agrees on. Famous commenters like Professor Sachs, he has said so explicitly. He belongs to that organization. The Secretary General of the United Nations also recognizes that fact. He finds himself in the unfortunate position of presiding over the League of Nations during the Second World War. I think we are now at an inflection point, at a breaking point, at which a new order has to be invented. And this order will have to be fought with hand and tooth and nail. And civilians will be scot-free in this situation. That's what I wanted to say.
Hans, do you have any remarks on that?
Well, I think I agree with what Alexander said. We're in the situation where of inversion of rules, basically, whereas today you're not supposed to, you're not expected to to be considerate to your opponent, to be considerate to the civilian population of the opponent. That's a general accepted rule today. And I think in looking at back at European history, I think that's a stupid thing to do. I think you cannot have an intricate, an organization, or not an organization, like a group of states living together, coexisting, that have no rules, use no rules, because you have to have in any organization, even the mafia organization, a mafia family, or any group of people, any group of organizations, any sort of framework needs certain guides of principles, conduct, guides of guides to behavior, behavioral guides. You cannot have an organization like an international politics without certain accepted rules and regulations. You cannot. So that's the inherent fact of humans coexisting and doing things together, whether it's good-natured or bad, but you need rules. You cannot have an organization or a society without rules. It's impossible, even in an international framework. Also, that's what I think. Maybe you don't agree, but
Charles, would you like to? Do you have any comments?
Yeah, several things come to mind, but the first thing I want to say is, listening to the sentiments so far, it makes me wonder if this is why Europe's in the condition it is now, this sort of privileging of rules over your existence. So these rules are more important than preserving your very existence. And that seems ridiculous to me. That's the first point. The second point is the idea that armies were more disciplined, that Hans referred to earlier, and that they maintained sort of battles in a circumvented area, and you had only, for the most part, soldiers being killed. I think that was by necessity more than by plan. I mean, it was like the numbers of soldiers, what they could do with the arms they had. It made more sense to kill other soldiers than to try to attack nearby towns or cities for the most part. And so that's not like some moral, they're not moral paragons for doing that. It's just like by necessity and useful tactics as compared to the total war of the 20th century. And also, indirectly, they were killing a lot of civilians by burning crops, destroying buildings that were necessary for food production. It may not have been direct, machine gunning people or gassing them, but they were indirectly starving people and displacing people. So I don't think that's any more honorable than directly killing them. And that's happened for centuries. Another point is that I think all of you are referring to a short period of European history as the standard, like early modern times. Whereas, I mean, the Huns didn't abide by rules when they attacked Rome. The Vandals didn't abide by any rules. The Vikings didn't abide by. Those are all Europeans or semi-Europeans. So I think you have sort of this ideal period from 1580 to 1820 or something like that. That this is, for some reason, we're supposed to abide by the rules created in that period of time, which I don't think there's any reason to do that.
Well, I understand what you're right. It's a brief period of European history, but it's also a period where the armies were the biggest, and the violence and the kinetic violence was also the most extreme in European history until the First World War. So, I think Clausewitz says, doesn't he, that you win a war by destroying your enemy militarily. So, if you want to win a war, you go for the jugular, which is the army of the opponent. So that's what you hit. You don't spend.
I would disagree with that also.
Pardon?
I would disagree with that also.
Okay, well, that's still, I think, the main principle of warfare still today. You destroy the enemy's army. That's what you do first. If you're weak and you like Persia at the moment or Iran, then you destroy the infrastructure of the enemy. But you go for the enemy's army. That's what you do, because the enemy army can also hurt you. So you have to. It makes sense to go for the army first, or for the armed forces first, and then
that's sort of
see what you can do.
That sort of presumes that the time of conflict will be bounded, and you'll say, well, it's going to end at a certain date, and if we defeat these people who are presently soldiers within this time period, then we'll win. It's not really looking forward at all to, well, there are going to be sons from all these men we're killing who want revenge, which was the more ancient way of looking at it, the more realistic way of looking at it, and the non-idealistic ways. We're not just fighting these men who are currently soldiers in their current technology. We're fighting a civilization and a way of life. And their relatives and their children are not just going to say, "Oh, that was the end of that game. I guess we can move on now." I mean, that's preposterous.
No, but that's the way. I'm describing the way things work in Europe, and
modern Europe.
That's still the thing that the way things go, because in order to be a soldier, you have to train a lot. You can not just anybody can be a soldier or go to the army. You need to go through a period of training. You need to be familiar with the organization and the weaponry and everything. So it does require preparation, and this is sort of an investment.
That changes too. That changes too. I mean, tactics change. As the Americans waged sort of a guerrilla war on Great Britain during the Revolution, the American Revolution, by necessity.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, yeah. You can, there are certain situations that sort of that superseded that, but it also the problem was exacerbated because the English were far from home, and they were not in their own country, so they were at a disadvantage. So this sort of things also play a role. But basically,
but don't you think that?
Yes.
I was just going to ask a question. Don't you think that people often create rules to benefit themselves? So the people who think that these rules will help them to win in the long run agree to those rules, and the people who don't think those rules will help them to win in the long run disagree with those rules.
Well, as far as the rules in the sort of the Hague Peace Conference, all countries in the world participated, and they all agreed. They all thought it was good. They all did. The United States also,
I
and
mean,
Russia
that's like,
also.
I mean, I'm living in the United States right now where our government is doing something that me and a lot of other people disagree with. So what does that even mean? Our nation may be pursuing some course of action that a lot of the people disagree with.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Well,
I
that's
mean,
that's the advantage of democracy.
Well,
That's
it's
democracy. Yes.
yeah. Well, it's not, of course, we're now discussing the conditions in which these Hague conventions took place and how they formed and got shaped. And there was, of course, the idea that we should minimize civilian casualties. This is, I guess, the core, and that we have to minimize unnecessarily suffering. So,
right.
expanding ammunitions were not allowed. Poison gas was not allowed. And so I think we have to move on to the main point of the article now, and that is that we see a regression basically from at least an attempt, formalized or not, to have sort of civilized warfare to an absolute regression to the barbarism that preceded these Hague Conventions, in which there was indeed, as you said, the choice to exterminate entire populations because who knows how many children will grow up with revengeful hearts. This is actually openly admitted by many Israeli soldiers that they want to kill the children because they don't want them to grow up wrathful and seeking vengeance. Um,
Yes.
It's the
so
history of the world.
it is,
How can
yes.
people pretend that that doesn't happen?
Well, I don't think that the Hague Conventions were an attempt to, try and pretend it doesn't happen. It was an attempt, however naive it may have been, to put an end to the greatest barbarism that comes with war. But as you rightfully mentioned, we can have all kinds of treaties. If they are not honored, then they mean nothing. I mean, we live in the European Union that basically transgresses every treaty there is. We have a Schengen zone in which we are free to move, but it was supposed to be surrounded by European borders guarded by Frontex. But the European Union completely doesn't do so. So we are swimming in treaties that are not honored, and what we see in the Middle East is, and that's basically the point, I guess, the total breakdown of international law and of any attempt to be civilized. And in doing some research before this podcast, I came across some interesting facts, and that is that already in February of 2025, Israel made the umpteenth request to the United States to receive their mother of all bombs. Now, they have been asking for this for over 25 years, and never has the United States agreed to supply these weapons. And these are, one step down from nuclear weapons. The Moab, the massive ordnance air blast bomb, is the heaviest weapon apart from nuclear materials. And now, all of a sudden, in 2025, this is granted already in February. So the bomb wasn't delivered yet, but they were told Israel that they could receive this ammunitions along with very heavy bunker buster munitions. So already in February, they expected to, for the conflict to escalate. And of course, they say that, well, this Moab bomb is intended for deep military installations, but it would also be very effective at flattening the center of Tehran, of course. So um, I think that we see the reintroduction of the purposeful targeting of civilian targets by all parties. I mean, the United States blew up this school, with 160 girls, but it turns out these girls were all daughters of the Revolutionary Guard officers. So it was a deliberate attempt to break the morals of your enemy by targeting civilian targets, and I think that is something that even the Nazis did not do in the Second World War. So would anybody like to comment on that?
Yes, well, I think that Charles brought up a valid point, and that is that international law, the effort at keeping up the pretense of international law is a handicap. So I think at the moment that you want to abide by laws and you want to play by rules that other people do not agree on, you actually are fighting at a disadvantage. This is also what we are seeing in the so-called special military operation that is being fought by President Putin, who is a lawyer, of course. Very precise, very delineated, very civilized, very restrained, not even called a war. Taking the utmost best, doing the utmost best not to target civilians. But of course, this is tying the hands behind the back of the Russian army, which probably could have ended this conflict quite quickly if it would have gone all out and not lived by these rules. The same is, of course, true at what we are seeing in the Middle East right now. So we have an Islamic Republic which refuses, on moral grounds, to produce nuclear bombs. If they would have produced a nuclear bomb, there would have probably been no war. They also fight with one hand behind their back because they restrain themselves on all kinds of moral grounds. For example, they think it is wrong to bomb desalination plants because that would deprive their enemy, the civilian population, of water, which would be a grave sin considering the Shia faith, in which the Battle of Karbala was also waged by an unjust enemy that deprived the victims of water. So there are all kinds of rules being maintained on the side of the Russians, on the side of the Iranians, in other conflicts that also applies, that are totally disproportional because they only handicap the war effort of the people that apply these rules. So Charles is certainly right that when it comes to an existential fight, a fight for your very existence, it is doing a disfavor to your own cause, your own nation, your own people to abide by such law. But I think that we should not forget the power of the law, the original driving power behind the old European law from which international law was deprived. And I think this was an honor code. The honor code between nobility, between kings, sovereigns, and Christians. So people that imposed this law. This law was not naturally given. It was deliberately imposed on the world and on the nations of Europe. As Hans pointed out, the German army executed people in its own ranks who deviated from this law. And infractions were severely punished. And the sporting aspect should not be forgotten. So we are talking here about aristocrats who ruled Europe, who are all related to each other, who all knew each other, who all communicated together even in wartime, who put great stock in behavioral rules above anything else. They would rather die than give up their honor code. And I think this animating principle is not entirely gone from Europe, which also explains why Russia is behaving the way it does, why also Europeans still have this quaint reference for this law. I think it is something that is left over, that is implanted in the psyche of the people that were ruled once upon a time by this kind of people. And just to illustrate how far the point is going. So the honor code of not surprising your enemy, of giving due notice of a war declaration, of not taking advantage unfairly. This is like a sporting match. You should understand what this is. So, like people in a sporting match have rules and they abide voluntarily by them, so did Europeans in law. I'm talking about a relatively brief period, but an important period, because that's the time when Europe started to rule the world and Western civilization came into existence, as we know called Western civilization, and the law order that was with us until very recently, up till, let's say, up till Trump. So I think to give an illustration of how far people took their honor code, there is one of those many conflicts that have been forgotten by also by Europeans, was the Austrian War of Succession. So this was a war that was being fought over the succession to the Austrian throne. Who could sit on it was an issue that decided on borders, and European monarchs, they found themselves caught up in this war, which was the equivalent of a world war at that time. But it was fought in very strict honor code laws. So professional armies, limited engagements, no plundering, except in very special circumstances where the enemy became unreasonable, then he was punished by plundering. And there was a famous battle fought in Belgium, where many of these battles were fought in an area that's now called Fontenoy. Fontenoy, it was a battle between on the one hand, the British and Austrian and Dutch forces, and on the other hand, the the French. So the French commander and the British commander, they met each other in battle. They surprised each other, which you're not supposed to do in a battle. And the two armies confronted each other on a hill. And one line of soldiers was standing in front of the other, and each was surprised because they were not supposed to do something out of the book. And then the French officer, he took off his hat, he bowed to the enemy, and he said, Après vous, you can shoot first. And then the French officer refused. He took on his hat and he said, No, no, you can shoot first. This is an anecdote, but it shows the psychology of European fighting. This is aristocratic fighting. And I think we can all agree on one thing. The people that are fighting wars right now are not aristocrats. That's what I wanted.
Well, I guess
And
you could say it's like a souped-up version of a simple duel. There were very strict rules for a duel with pistols or with swords, and basically larger combat was an enlargement of these principles.
yeah, and that's
There's
what I was
something
saying
else.
earlier,
Yeah.
Yes,
treating it
Charles.
as a game rather than a life and death struggle.
Yes.
And besides, do you get to decide the honor of 50,000 men for them? In a duel, it's you and someone else. So you can decide on honor in terms of your person. But in deciding the honor of 50,000 men, allowing someone else to shoot first, is that your responsibility or your privilege to do so? I mean, I
I
do
think,
agree that it's been a game all this time. That's the
I think,
problem.
I think
Exactly
Yes.
the problem.
you bring up an excellent point because what actually this is about, it is the question of who is worth, who is human, who is the enemy, and who can be counted. And I think in that time, I'm talking about 18th century, aristocrats, they had their own life. They did not think about the people that were under them. They had some kind of rules which conform to their values of aesthetics, their concept of aesthetics, more than ethics. Aesthetics were more important. It's like a sport game in a certain sense, blood sports, literally. And I think now what we are seeing is the same. Because also there is a class of people now in the world that thinks they are above any kind of rule. They can drive their car, they can have hospitals, they can have normal food supplies, they can have their children go to school, but that doesn't apply to anybody else. The others can be bombed. I think that the same divide is still with us. Only the percentages have changed and roles have been reverted. And I think one thing I would like to add. I think the aesthetic part, which definitely was something that European aristocrats aspired to, that's completely gone. And with it, as ethics have also disappeared. This is what I think.
And yeah, I would like to go to, of course, Evola. I think that is very fitting. He of course, wrote this book called The Metaphysics of War. And he, of course, lays out the case that there's the sort of small jihad and the big jihad, right? So you have the actual physical war that's going on, and then you have your own struggle, or at least your combat or fight to overcome the fear of death and overcome the small war and be able to engage in these activities with absolute no fear of death, because you turn your back on death, and you simply don't, you're not affected by the presence of death. Or Carl Junger, as he writes so beautifully in his books about the front in the First World War. And I think these Evola lays out very beautifully why these conflicts have nothing to do with any sort of war like that. I mean, he would be appalled by the idea that we would simply throw bombs from the air on unarmed, defenseless people. There's absolutely no honor in that at all. And it is very bestial, and it is very basic, and it is very much about simply destroying every instance or every every occurrence of your nemesis, basically, because this is a war against Amalek. It is the against the Goy and the non-Jew, and it is deeply religious in nature, and that is a very different animal from the war or yeah, wars that occurred in Europe.
But that makes me think of is it really essentially different than the Middle Ages or ancient times? I think about when the English used the longbow against the French, and there were around 2,500 or 3,000 English in Agincourt, and there were what 30,000 French, and they were shooting the longbow what 200 yards away or something, and killing thousands of these men. Is that honorable? What were they thinking at that point? Were the knights thinking this is not honorable?
Yeah, that's a good
Yes,
question.
yes. I didn't think it was honorable. The French knights were surprised, and they were indignant that the English would use these longbowmen to shoot at armed knights, because the French expected the Agincourt battle to be like a normal medieval battle, where the armed so the heavy cavalry uh, composed of knights in armor, they would fight first, and then they would decide, and
Right.
then later on the infantry could join. But
But it's
guys like the Welshmen with the longbows, they were regarded as very, very sort of ignominious, and that's
but
why
it's
for a
sort of
long time the
a
English had.
rhetorical question, though.
Pardon?
It's sort of a
Pardon?
rhetorical question because if you have two knights approach one another, or they're going to assess each other's armor and make sure they're equal strength armor. Otherwise, they can't fight because this guy has lesser armor than you do. I mean, it's a
Yes,
slippery slope, you know. You can always say, well,
of
he doesn't
course.
have exactly the weapons that are necessary to have a fair fight, so we shouldn't fight. Where does it end? Where does it end where you decide he has some unfair advantage that's not honorable, and so I can't fight him? That's just unrealistic. You know, it's like humans are always creating new ways of doing things, including fighting, attacking, and it's just that rules are lagging behind in some idealistic period about what should be. And
You're right.
basically what they're telling the enemy, don't think anymore. Just stay where we were 100 years ago or 50 years ago, and let's do that. I don't want you to try to figure something out new. But underlying that is the message, I don't want you to win by using some new tactic or some new strategy, I think.
Well,
A war is war. You know the old saying, all's fair in love and
yeah,
war.
yeah, yeah,
War
that's
is war.
true.
And once you
Yeah,
decide to go to war, anything goes. Otherwise, it's not war, in my opinion.
yeah. Well, that's also true. But then if because many of these European wars were between neighboring countries, and it's a long series of wars, so they were used to a sort of pattern in those wars. And when somebody like the English at Azincourt, the English king, didn't have enough money to or enough sort of power to recruit a big army of knights, in relying instead on, because he was short of funds, on these people from Wales, these sort of commoners from Wales. Then with this, he broke sort of the rules, but he won the battle. Okay, so it's also this sort of thing that happens. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's history.
Well, that
Yeah.
goes back to my point that the people who believe that they are already the most powerful are the ones who want to abide by the rules. It
Yeah,
benefits them to abide by
yeah, yeah,
the
Yeah,
sure,
precepts.
sure.
I disagree on that because we have the very good example, of course, in the Second World War with the Germans. You know, the Germans insisted that they fought according to some sort of code that they had. The SS were highly regimented, highly trained, highly moral, highly infused with an ethical code. They would rather die and go extinct standing for that code than that they would employ tactics that they deemed, dishonorable.
Unethical, yes. Mhm.
Yes, they were extremely reluctant in bombing, civilian targets, as I already mentioned. The English went on for days and days and days before Hitler finally made the decision to strike back at London, and he really didn't want to. And as I said, he could have massacred the English at Dunkirk. He enclosed them. He could have simply killed them all. He could have
Right.
used poisonous gas. He could have used espionage. He could have used commandos, which they didn't, and because they thought it was a very dishonorable way of fighting. And if they caught commandos, enemy commandos behind enemy lines, they were immediately executed. The same was for people who committed resistance fighters, who didn't wear soldier uniforms. They acted as combatants, but they were beyond the code of honor and therefore dishonorable, shot on sight if they were caught. And this is the entire ethic of the Second World War German army, and this is something that many people simply do not understand. They wanted to exist on their own terms, and that is as an honorable people. And if that was impossible, they were willing to sacrifice everything. And this is something that is well, let's say the Middle East conflict bears no resemblance to that whatsoever.
Yeah, I would
So,
second
but
the I would second the motion because I believe that not every war it fought for the same reasons for both sides. So there is this war for life or death, right? It says there are two options: there's life and death. So if you only cling to life and that's your goal, you want to survive, your motivations will be different than if you embrace death. There are cultures, there are countries, and there are people that, in fact, look upon war as a means to achieve immortality. So, to achieve immortality also existed in the ancient times. Of course, the Romans had certain grades of soldiers, officers, that were already in the realm of the sacred. They were already immortal. So did the Persians. The Persians had a guard that couldn't be beaten. They were called the immortals. Why? Because they were dedicated to die. Their only thing that they strove towards on the battlefield is to die in as honorable a way as possible and in the service of their king. So I think to understand the motivation of your enemy is very important here. It can be a misunderstanding. Look, if both sides fight for the same gain and they fight for survival, things become very rational and very clear very quickly and very efficient very quickly. But if one side doesn't, it's fighting for other goals that are beyond the reference frame, the comprehension system of, for example, the aggressor, in this case in the Middle East, then things become very complicated because what goal are you going to motivate? What goal are you going to articulate if the enemy seeks death? And I think this is something that unfortunately is now gone from Western perception. Um, I think that the Western perception of the value of honor and the value of a hero's death has disappeared somewhat from the public discourse. It's still alive in the margins and in historical conscience, perhaps a little bit downtrodden, a little bit hidden, but in the public domain and in public policy, it's not. And I think the real confrontation in this sense is between those that seek the old martial honor and death included as a win, as a gain, towards the people that pursue exclusively, I would say, imminent values being without transcendental reference, without thought for the world to come. That's what I wanted to say.
Mhm. Yeah.
I can make
Yes, I
one
think
response.
yes, of course, Charles.
I mean, that's fine if all of the warriors have that mentality and they freely decide to fight. But when you're conscripting tens of thousands of people who don't want to fight at all, you can't apply that standard to them, I would say. You can't expect them to be, thinking about their imminent immortality or their, realizing the heroic within themselves. I just don't think you can apply that standard from ancient or medieval times to modern times. Now, if you ask everyone if they want to fight for that reason, that's a different thing. And also, once you've created mass methods of killing, it's hard to square that with the heroic warrior mentality for me. If you're killing a group of people in a second, you're not fighting one on one, hand to hand. I don't see the honor in that.
This what you're
Mhm.
bringing up
That's
is,
all
I
I'm gonna
think,
say.
Yes.
yeah, what Charles just said now, I think it brings up the quintessential issue here because um, referring back to what Sietse just said about he is recalling the writings of Jünger, yeah. So in Stahlgewitter, so in the storms of steel, is a book that he wrote about his experiences in the Somme battle, 1916, which was a Materialschlacht, so a battle of material. Exactly what Charles says, an overwhelming force that mathematically reduces the individual to zero, gives him 0% of survival chances. And there is a scene in this book that Jünger, or a soldier that incorporates Jünger's spirit, stands up, goes out of the shelter being the only thing keeping him away from the rain of steel, which is molten hot steel raining down every centimeter of the battlefield, eradicating literally everything. And this man goes outside and he stands in that force, and this is a transformative experience. By some miracle, he survived, and he goes back a changed man. And I think this is of course, the battle of the spirit against the material world, which is overwhelmingly materialized in the morning world. So the reign of quantity versus the quality of the spirit. And I like to remind here in this conversation the First World War experience. The chances of survival in certain battles were very little, no matter on which side. And the survival chances over a year span were astronomically low. So most people ended up or wounded or severely disfigured, or they were killed if they stayed more than, let's say, a number of months in the battle. There was a soldier, he was a corporal, and he survived 3 years of that. And I think we all know his name. That's what I want to add.
Austrian painter.
Was amazing.
Yes. So and Charles brings up, of course, a very good point. But let's say in the Japanese army, which of course had kamikaze fighters, these were all voluntary people. They volunteered to be in kamikaze units, and it was considered the ultimate honor if you could give your life deliberately for the emperor. And of course, this harkens back to samurai mentality. The samurai considered themselves dead. And therefore, in each battle that they survived was a sort of a miracle, because they expect to die in every
Bonus. Yes.
yes, in every conflict they engage in. And you cannot have that mentality from a transcripted, or from a conscripted military, because with conscripted militaries you always see a large amounts of surrenders and defection when things get really difficult, because they are simply not motivated. They don't fight for a deeper reason. And what the soldier of the Reich understood is that to a certain extent, to die for the fatherland and for the future of their people was the highest good. That's why they had the skull and crossbones on their uniforms. It wasn't because they wanted to inflict death on their enemy. It was that they were, ready to lay down their lives for the future of their folk, of their people. And I think that is something very fundamentally different to, the wars that we see now, and the breakdown in any sort of honor and ethics in war.
And I do think that's admirable, just to be clear, but that's not what's happening for the most part now.
No.
So that's why I think applying these aristocratic norms from 1680 or whatever to today just doesn't work, I don't think,
No.
Well, have you ever seen the movie Patton? The movie Patton,
Maybe
about General Patton.
Yeah.
At a certain point, he talks about how he would like to just get in his tank and go out and meet Rommel in his tank, and whoever wins the battle between those two wins the war. It's sort of the quintessential medieval knight challenging someone to a fight or to a duel in later years, later centuries.
Yeah.
The tank as a horse.
Just wanted to mention
Yes.
it.
Well, I wouldn't bump into I wouldn't want to degrade America at all. I think America also has a heroic tradition. I would say at the same level as Europe. There's this famous movie, Gone with the Wind, right? Which is politically very
Yeah.
incorrect because it shows certain role patterns. In any case, one of the heroes, Red Butler, he refuses to fight. He's just a pragmatist. He's earning money. He is doing very well from the war, and he is not interested in fighting for the stupid lost cause of the Southern states. But when he knows for 100% sure that the battle is lost, Atlanta has fallen, he decides to join the Southern Confederate Army. I find that a very it shows that something of that heroic spirit, of that chivalry spirit,
In the
must be
South.
alive in the
Yes.
United States, and there must be. And well, perhaps Charles can enlighten us because he comes from Texas, and what more martial state do we have than Texas in the United States?
South Carolina.
Well, I don't know if that's possible since they elected Lindsey Graham, but
Yeah.
I've often wondered what's going on over there. I don't really know. Not that I like all of our elected politicians in Texas either, but still.
No,
Oh.
because the Citadel, the military school, that's South Carolina,
Oh,
right?
right. Okay, good point. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, I think
Right.
there's
So,
still in the South more of a veneration for honor than the North.
yeah.
I mean, because the industrialization process started with machines in the North, and then it was applied to human beings, I think. Now, I do believe that humans in the North are more mechanized in general. Not all, but just in conversations over the years and stuff, and reading opinions and the way they express things, especially urban.
Yes. Yes.
Mhm.
That's a whole other subject that we can do a very interesting podcast on sometime. And I think that seeing that we have been busy for over an hour right now, I think that we all said the things that we wanted to say. I presume if anybody wants to make any concluding statements, then do so right now. Or forever hold your silence. No. All right. So I thank you very much. I think this was a very interesting, peekaboo about the Middle East and the origins of the Hague Treaties. And we of course want to see you in our next episode. So goodbye and see you next time.